That Friday night was etched in my memory as one of the most profound moments of my life, a night when the boundaries of my carefully constructed world began to blur. The house was enveloped in an almost unnatural tranquility, a silence so deep that it instilled in me a rare sense of serenity. It was a calm I desperately needed after a grueling week, filled with the responsibilities of work, home, and parenting. Being a single mother for the past 8 years had demanded everything from me. Since my divorce, my relationship with my ex-husband had remained amicable, practical, even. We had simply grown apart, and though we parted on relatively good terms, the weight of raising our son, Jimmy, now nearly 20, had fallen solely on my shoulders. Parenting Jimmy had been both the most rewarding and challenging task of my life. He was intelligent, kind, and fiercely loyal, a reflection of all the qualities I cherished most. Yet, as he grew older, I often worried that he carried burdens beyond his years. His thoughtful, quiet nature sometimes hid deeper struggles that he rarely expressed, and I could only hope he felt supported despite the gaps I could never quite fill. That evening, I barely had the energy to change into my pajamas before collapsing into bed. The house was silent, with Jimmy having gone to bed hours earlier after finishing his homework and playing video games. The moonlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting soft, shifting shadows on the walls of my room. I nestled under the warm covers, my mind wandering to the life Jimmy and I had built together. It hadn't been easy, but we had come through the worst together, creating a bond one cherished above all else. As I drifted into a state of drowsiness, my thoughts were filled with gratitude and pride for the young man Jimmy had become. Just as I felt sleep overtaking me, a soft knock on my bedroom door brought me back to full wakefulness. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, but then the knock came again, gentle but insistent. "Mom?" Jimmy's voice broke the quiet, hesitant yet clear. I blinked, sitting up slightly and focusing on the door. The dim light from the hallway outlined his familiar figure. "Jimmy? What's wrong?" I asked, my voice heavy with sleep. He hesitated before stepping into the room, closing the door softly behind him. His movements were deliberate, almost cautious, and as he approached the side of my bed, I could see the tension etched on his face. "I couldn't sleep," he said simply, his gaze shifting to the floor. I knew immediately that it wasn't just insomnia keeping him awake. Jimmy had struggled with sleep issues on and off since the divorce, but it wasn't something he often admitted. Tonight, the sorrow in his eyes told me more than his words ever could. "Come here," I said, patting the empty space beside me. "You can stay here with me if you want." He hesitated for a moment, then climbed onto the bed, lying down beside me. As he settled on his side, facing me, I noticed the vulnerability in his expression, something I hadn't seen in years. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked softly. He shook his head, his dark hair falling over his forehead. "No, I just wanted to be close to you." A warmth spread through me, a mixture of tenderness and longing. It had been so long since Jimmy had sought comfort like this, reminiscent of the nights when he was small and would crawl into my bed after a bad dream. I reached out and brushed his hair back gently, smiling down at him. "That's okay," I whispered, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You can stay as long as you need to." He smiled faintly, but his eyes betrayed the weight of something unspoken. Rather than pressing him, I pulled the blanket over us and let the quiet settle around us. His breathing slowed, and for a moment I thought he had fallen asleep. But then, in the faintest of whispers, he asked, "Mom, do you ever miss him?" The question startled me. I knew instantly he was talking about his father, and a familiar ache rose in my chest. It wasn't a topic we often discussed, and I had worked hard to shield Jimmy from the more painful aspects of our separation. "We had a complicated relationship, Jimmy," I said carefully. "You know that." He nodded but didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the edge of the blanket he was nervously fiddling with. "Do you ever wonder if things could have been different?" I sighed, searching for the right words. "Maybe," I admitted. "But we can't change the past. All we can do is move forward." Jimmy's shoulders slumped slightly, and his voice, when he spoke again, was barely audible. "Sometimes I feel like it was my fault. Like if I had been better, maybe Dad wouldn't have left. His words cut through me like a knife. I sat up fully, turning to face him. "No," I said firmly, my voice trembling with emotion. "Jimmy, you did nothing wrong. None of this was your fault." He averted his gaze, his expression filled with pain he had clearly carried for years. "Sometimes it feels like," he hesitated, his voice cracking, "like I wasn't enough." Tears welled in my eyes as I reached for him, pulling him into a tight embrace. For a moment, he resisted, but then he melted into my arms, burying his face in my shoulder. "Listen to me," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Your father made his choices, and they had nothing to do with you. You have always been enough, more than enough. You're everything to me, Jimmy. Always." He nodded against my shoulder, but I could still feel the tension in his body, the weight of years of guilt and doubt pressing down on him. We stayed like that for a long time, holding onto each other in the stillness of the room. As his breathing slowed and deepened, I realized he had finally drifted off to sleep. But my mind remained restless, my thoughts swirling in the darkness. Memories of our life together, of the struggles we had endured, played in my mind like a film. And yet, amidst the comfort of his embrace, an unexpected feeling stirred within me, something deeper, more intimate, that I couldn't quite name. It was a warmth that spread through my chest, a connection that felt as unshakable as it was unfamiliar. I tried to dismiss it, to focus instead on the rhythmic rise and fall of his breathing. But the sensation lingered, whispering in the quiet corners of my mind. As dawn painted the room in soft hues, I woke to find Jimmy still sleeping soundly beside me. His face was peaceful, the tension of the previous night seemingly erased. I watched him for a moment, my heart swelling with love and pride. But that unnameable feeling persisted, a subtle undercurrent beneath the surface of my maternal affection. Quietly, I slipped out of bed and made my way downstairs to prepare breakfast. The familiar routine offered some comfort, but my thoughts kept circling back to the vulnerability in Jimmy's eyes, the way he had clung to me as though I were his anchor. Soon, Jimmy appeared in the doorway, his hair tousled, his eyes still heavy with sleep. "Good morning, sleepyhead," I said, forcing a bright smile as I set a plate of pancakes on the table. "Morning," he murmured, sliding into his chair. We ate in companionable silence, the morning light casting a warm glow over the kitchen. I caught his gaze lingering on me a few times, but he quickly looked away, as though unsure of how to broach whatever was on his mind. Finally, he spoke. "Thanks for last night, Mom." I smiled softly. "You don't have to thank me, Jimmy. I'll always be here for you, no matter what." He nodded, his eyes meeting mine for a moment longer than usual. Something unspoken hung in the air between us, a connection that felt both familiar and new. The soft glow of the morning sun filtered through the curtains, bathing the room in warm golden light. I stirred awake, the quiet stillness of the house settling around me. Turning my head, I saw Jimmy still asleep beside me, his face relaxed and peaceful. His breathing was steady, and in that moment, he looked so much like the boy I had raised, the boy who once clung to me after bad dreams, seeking comfort in my arms. But now, at nearly 20, he was no longer that child. He was a young man, carrying a maturity that both filled me with pride and made my heart ache with nostalgia. I slipped out of bed carefully, pulling the blanket up over his shoulder so he wouldn't feel the morning chill. As I made my way downstairs, the quiet creaks of the wooden steps were the only sounds in the house. Entering the kitchen, I began the familiar routine of making breakfast. The smell of coffee brewing and the gentle sizzle of pancakes on the griddle filled the air, grounding me in the simplicity of the moment. Still, my mind kept returning to the night before. The vulnerability Jimmy had shown, the pain in his voice as he spoke about his father, it stayed with me. His words about feeling not enough struck a chord deep in my heart. I had tried my best to reassure him, to let him know that his father's decisions had never been his fault. But even as I held him close, I couldn't help questioning myself. Had I done enough to shield him from that pain? I tried to shake off the heaviness, focusing instead on the comforting rhythm of cooking. Jimmy was my son, and I loved him more than anything. That love had always been my anchor, and I hoped it was enough to guide him through the challenges he faced. I heard his soft footsteps on the stairs before I saw him. When he entered the kitchen, his hair was tousled, and his sleepy eyes made me smile. "Good morning, sleepyhead," I greeted him, sliding a plate of pancakes onto the table. "Morning," he mumbled, settling into his chair. He reached for the syrup and began eating, the familiar routine easing the lingering tension between us. We ate in comfortable silence, the sunlight streaming through the window casting a warm glow over the room. I caught him glancing at me occasionally, but I didn't press him to speak. I wanted to give him space, knowing he would talk when he was ready. Finally, he broke the silence. "Thanks for last night, Mom," he said quietly, his voice sincere. "You don't have to thank me, Jimmy," I replied with a soft smile. "I'll always be here for you, no matter what." He nodded, his gaze lingering on me a moment longer. There was something in his eyes, a depth, a quiet intensity that I couldn't quite place. I wanted to say more, to reassure him further, but I sensed he needed time to process his thoughts. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. Jimmy retreated to his room, dividing his time between homework and video games, while I busied myself with chores around the house. Yet, despite the normalcy of the day, there was an unspoken shift in the air. It was subtle, like a thread pulling us closer together in ways I couldn't fully understand. That evening, after dinner, we decided to watch a movie together. Jimmy chose an action comedy, and we settled on the couch, the dim lighting from the screen casting flickering shadows on the walls. As the film played, I found myself acutely aware of his presence beside me. His arm brushed against mine now and then, sending a strange warmth through me. I tried to focus on the movie, but my mind kept drifting to him. Halfway through, he shifted slightly, his arm pressing against mine and staying there. This time, neither of us moved away. The quiet closeness between us felt comforting, almost protective. I glanced at him, and our eyes met briefly. He gave me a small, reassuring smile, and I returned it, feeling a sense of peace settle over me. When the movie ended, we stayed on the couch, letting the credits roll by unnoticed. I rested my head against his shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. It was a small gesture, but it felt deeply meaningful, a reminder of the bond we shared. "Mom," he said softly, breaking the silence. "Yes, I'm really glad you're here," he whispered. His words, simple yet heartfelt, stayed with me. "I'm glad you're here too," I replied, my voice just as quiet. The night felt heavier somehow, as though the air itself was holding all the unspoken emotions between us. As we sat there, I realized how much we had both grown, not just as individuals, but together. Jimmy had always been my strength, and now I wanted to be his, in whatever way he needed. We stayed like that for a long time, the quiet wrapping around us like a comforting blanket. And as the house fell into silence, I knew that this closeness, this bond we had rebuilt, was something I would cherish forever. The house was quiet, the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floor the only sounds breaking the stillness. Outside, the evening was calm, with stars scattered across the dark canvas of the sky. Jimmy had retreated to his room after dinner, and I busied myself clearing the table and tidying up the kitchen. Yet, despite the mundane routine, my thoughts lingered on the subtle shifts in our relationship over the past few days. I couldn't deny the changes I had noticed, Jimmy's maturity, the quiet strength he had grown into, and the way our bond had deepened as we navigated life together. He wasn't just my son anymore, he was also my closest confidant, someone I relied on in ways I hadn't anticipated. Later that evening, I found myself on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket against the cool autumn air. The stars were bright, their light reflecting on the surface of the small pond at the edge of the yard. The tranquility of the night was soothing, offering a brief reprieve from the whirlwind of thoughts that had been consuming me. Jimmy joined me a few moments later, stepping onto the porch with a mug of tea in hand. "Thought you might like this," he said with a small smile, handing me the mug. "Thank you," I said softly, accepting the warm drink. He sat down beside me, and we shared a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't require words. The night stretched on, the stillness wrapping around us like a cocoon. At some point, Jimmy broke the silence. "Do you ever think about the future, Mom?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. I turned to look at him, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the porch light. "Of course," I replied. "But the future always feels uncertain, doesn't it? We can plan, but life has a way of surprising us." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the stars. "I just want to make sure I'm doing the right thing, that I'm someone you're proud of." My heart ached at his words. "Jimmy, I'm already proud of you," I said, reaching out to place a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've grown into an incredible person, kind, thoughtful, and strong. You don't need to prove anything to me." He glanced at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something unspoken. "Thanks, Mom," he said softly. We stayed on the porch for a while longer, the conversation drifting to lighter topics, his plans for school, memories from his childhood, and little moments that had shaped who we were. By the time we went back inside, the connection between us felt stronger than ever, built on trust and mutual respect. As the days turned into weeks, I noticed how our relationship continued to evolve. We spent more time together, sharing stories and supporting each other through life's challenges. The bond we shared was no longer just about me being his mother. It was about two people who cared deeply for one another, offering strength and solace in equal measure. One rainy afternoon, we sat together in the living room, the steady rhythm of the rain creating a soothing backdrop. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. Jimmy was leaning against me, his head resting on my shoulder as we flipped through an old photo album. "Do you remember this?" he asked, pointing to a picture of us at the beach, his younger self grinning ear to ear as he held up a sandcastle he'd built. "Of course," I said with a laugh. "You were so proud of that sandcastle. I think you spent hours building it." He chuckled. "Yeah, and then the tide came in and washed it all away." I smiled, my fingers brushing over the edge of the photo. It didn't matter, though. What mattered was that we had fun together. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I guess that's true for a lot of things. It's not always about how things end, but about the moments we share along the way." His words stayed with me long after the photo album was closed and the fire had burned down to embers. They were a reminder that life was about embracing the present, finding joy in the connections we had, and holding onto the moments that truly mattered. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about how far we had come as a family. Life hadn't been easy for either of us, but we had faced every challenge together, growing stronger in the process. Jimmy's presence in my life was a gift, and I was grateful for the bond we shared. The future might be uncertain, but one thing was clear: we would face it together, as we always had. And in that realization, I found peace.